I'm Vinny Politan. Great to have you with us tonight. You know, we came across some documents related to an investigation by the Justice Department into an alleged illegal lobbying scheme. If you look at the documents, you'll see they are incredibly redacted. In fact, there are more black lines than text. So at this point, we know very little about this investigation. In fact, we have no idea who is under investigation. What we do know is that the government wants to get their hands on some attorney-client communications to see if they can build their case. To do so, they met with the judge without the other side present and then had all the information sealed. As a result, all we know is what is contained in that black-lined document. And it appears the government is trying to figure out if someone was illegally lobbying for a pardon and clemency. Now, this could be a really big story, or it could be much ado about nothing. We will only find out when and if the government decides to unseal those documents. In the meantime, while we're on the subject of pardons, Ashley Banfield joins us tonight to talk about pardons. And you know, every time I say that word pardon, the first thing that comes to mind is the earliest recollection. Pardon me. Remember that?
You took the wind right out of. I was about to say, I'm sorry, Vinny, pardon me. Yes, 1974. We were babes, but yeah, I do remember the news. I do remember it. And I was actually thinking a lot about Nixon and the Watergate pardon today as I was digging into the whole pardon story that's kind of plaguing cable news. Depending on what channel you watch, you probably hear a different version of what the president can do and what he can't do. But I think, Vinny, for Court TV to be able to look at the law as it pertains to not only pardons, but the ability for a president to pardon himself, this is a real treat because it's never happened before. So it's sort of fun to research this and understand what can be done, what can't be done, what can be tested, which way might it go. And when I talk about that, I talk about the preemptive pardon that everybody's been speaking about on the news, which means that President Trump is now reportedly speaking to advisors about preemptively pardoning himself, as well as his daughter Ivanka, his sons Eric and Donald Jr., and even Rudy Giuliani. No mention of Tiffany. But it was super interesting to think about the pardons in advance of anything being alleged or charged. Well, don't get hung up on that, because that can be done, period. It's kind of like immunity. But don't be surprised if that happens. It is definitely something that has happened before. And in fact, when you think about Nixon, the language was actually, pardonable crimes charged and uncharged. So there's your precedent there in terms of preemptive pardons before there's even a crime. But it doesn't pertain to future crimes. So if the pardon were to come down, the language, would likely need to incorporate those specific words: all crimes charged and uncharged on or before this document. So you would think that if you get that reprieve, that you're definitely not going to commit any crimes in the future, right? Yes, that would be a smart, guess.
That'd be a good move.
But let's talk about the pardoning himself. That is way less tested. And that's why I checked in with Duquesne University School of Law professor Joseph Mistick to ask some questions about whether a president can actually do that. Just go ahead and pardon himself preemptively.
Joe, it seems odd. Well, all of it seems odd, but it would seem odd for someone to be able to preemptively pardon himself for something that's not even being discussed or charged at this point. And yet it isn't odd, is it?
No, it's part and parcel of the presidential pardon power. Presidential pardons are as old as the Republic. The very first presidential pardons were issued right here, 30 miles from where I'm sitting, just outside of Pittsburgh, for two fellas who were convicted of treason as a part of the Whiskey Rebellion. George Washington granted them their pardons 6 years after the Constitution was adopted.
And yet pardons, I think people understand. They may be controversial, but they understand them. Maybe what's getting people a bit flummoxed is pardoning things that haven't actually happened or been considered to have happened. Pre-pardoning, preemptive pardoning. But that does happen. It's maybe a different way of wording it is immunity.
Well, it's a very, very broad sweeping power that presidents have. This is something that the courts have even affirmed and said that it's without review. It's without question. And the Congress cannot even limit the types of crimes for which a pardon can be granted because they've tried that. So a president has this broad power. They've all pretty much used it, some much more frequently than others. These peremptory challenges are difficult for people to get their arms around. But the best example of that is Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. No one knew for sure what Richard Nixon had done, and if something he had done had been deemed a crime, Gerald Ford had pardoned him for it in advance. So this has happened fairly often. But it is the most controversial part of the presidential pardon power.
And I think, without being specific, the wording was for all crimes charged and uncharged, which would be what we're talking about now with the reporting that the president might be considering preemptively pardoning himself and his children and maybe Rudy Giuliani as well. The one concept in law, though, that I want to outline, it's funny, as much research as I did on this today, I can't find out where it comes from. I just know it. I know it's there. I know you know it's there. I know everybody in the law profession knows it. It's under the fundamental rule that no one may be a judge in his own case. How does that factor into all of this?
Well, that's a great question, and we've really not come across it very often. Perhaps in the Nixon case, there was some talk about it, some consideration of it. There is one phrase in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, that makes an exception for impeachments. It gives the president this very broad power to pardon, and then it says, except for impeachment. So there are some highly respected constitutional scholars who believe that means that a president cannot pardon himself. There are just as many, I must say, on the other side, who believe that a president can pardon himself because the Constitution does not say that he cannot. That could be tested this time. The safer route to take, rather than test it and force it to the Supreme Court, the safer route to take, if a president were concerned and a president were interested in getting a pardon, would be to resign at the last minute, as Richard Nixon did. And have his incoming president, his vice president, who accedes to the Oval Office, have that new president grant the pardon, and that's unassailable if it's done that way. The other way is a big question. Big question.
There's another way that I could foresee. Tell me if I'm crazy. The 25th Amendment. A president could deem himself, and I think the wording is, it has to be specific. It has to be in front of the Senate. And he would have to actually acknowledge that he's unable to discharge the duties and powers of his office. And then Vice President Pence would effectively take over control, could issue pardons, and Donald Trump could once again resume office before the inauguration of the next president. Does that sound reasonable? I mean, maybe not reasonable, but feasible.
Yeah. Is that possible? I suppose it is, but the timing is short here. We don't have a lot of time. There's not much to be done after a presidential pardon. If he waits up to the last minute, the very last minutes before his term would expire, to resign and then have Vice President Pence grant the pardon, he'd be on safer ground. All of this other stuff is attractive, and I'm sure it's being discussed, Ashley. I mean,
I'll tell you what,
they're looking at every angle here, right?
I wish I could take credit for having come up with the idea, but the truth is it was an assistant attorney general in the Nixon DOJ that came up with two paths that was one. The other was asking for a congressional pardon. So in this circumstance, it would require Donald Trump to appeal to Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
In the world of possibilities, Those are probably the two least likely, I would think.
I had a,
Especially the pitch to Nancy Pelosi.
I had a
But
feeling you would say
the
that.
easier way, there is an easy way here. Richard Nixon did it the easiest way. And, there's still some controversy over that. Did he make the deal in advance with Gerald Ford? Gerald Ford swore to, until his death, that there was no deal in advance to pardon Nixon. In fact, he said he went out of his way to call Nixon and say, just so you don't misunderstand my position here, I'm not agreeing to pardon you. We'll see what happens when the time comes. And after the time came, he ended up getting a Profile in Courage Award, Ford did, for having made a decision that most people thought had spared the nation a lot of unpleasantness in some rather difficult times.
And let's be very clear. I'm sure a lot of our viewers who are Court TV fans know this, but it begs mention that a pardon only relates to federal issues, not state level issues.
Right.
And there are different investigations ongoing with the New York Attorney General as well as the Manhattan DA for potential tax issues. And I don't want to say fraud, but these are the words that are being thrown around, potentially tax fraud or bank fraud. And let's be clear, there is no pardon that could come from the president or the vice president that could cover him for that.
That's exactly right, Ashley. There is legal jeopardy in his future, regardless of how he handles this presidential pardon issue. That presidential pardon, of course, is only for federal crimes. And I would not be looking forward to the kind of scrutiny that is taking place and has been taking place and is likely to continue to take place at the hands of the Manhattan District Attorney.
And one issue is that the New York governor could then issue a pardon. But again, is that sort of akin to the request of Nancy Pelosi?
Yeah, that's something that's not likely to happen too. But every state has some mechanism similar to this that grants governors some clemency power. Clemency includes pardons and commutations. It's from the Latin clementia, which means gentleness. So it is a tip of the hat to our better angels. It's an opportunity for there to be some mercy in the criminal justice system.
These days, it depends on who you talk to. There's a fine line between angels and devils. And so this is a fascinating, it's a fascinating area. It's a great conversation to have. I mean, I guess the upside is that it's a great lesson in civics for people who may never have otherwise known about the mechanics of it all. Joe, thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me here. You take care now.
So, Vinny, the big question I think a lot of people are asking, the other question is, if Donald Trump were to pardon himself, and if he were to accept that pardon of himself, and if it were to be litigated and he were to prevail, what does that say about his exposure? I mean, doesn't that mean effectively that he's admitted to criminal activity? I talked to a couple of experts today. Paul Callan, one who is a legal analyst with CNN, said, no, not necessarily. A lot of people have been pardoned and never acknowledged that they were guilty. They felt that they were unjustly convicted. So not necessarily. But then I also found a Supreme Court decision, Burdick versus the United States, in which it says a pardon carries an imputation of guilt, and acceptance carries a confession. So I think that sort of makes it a very interesting proposition, no matter what the president decides to do. And if he's facing any criminal exposure at the state level in New York, I think it would be fascinating to find out what prosecutors would want to do with that pardon. It's a lot of ifs, but it is sort of an interesting set of parlor games, because if you're a prosecutor in New York, would you want to be able to say, this guy is, in effect, a felon? He's already admitted, his role in crime and was pardoned for it.
Yeah, the way I see that it would play publicly if this happened, and I have no idea if it's going to happen, would be, listen, I was the target of an investigation for 3 years for no crime at all, and I was the president of the United States. What is going to protect me when I become a private citizen from my adversary, who has control of the Department of Justice and the state of New York and other places, from targeting me again because they don't want me to run in 2024? That's the way I think it would play publicly.
Hey, I think you're right. I think Listen, you and I are on the same page. This is political, right? And it will continue to be political no matter what happens. But I do think effectively, just looking at those cases, particularly the Supreme Court case, it is interesting to see what the language is when it comes to if you accept a pardon. Can I just tell you that Burdick was given the right to either accept the pardon or not accept the pardon because he was worried that it would infringe upon his Fifth Amendment right to protect himself, and that was why this decision was made, and that language was used by the Supreme Court justices. I'm just super interested to see if that carries any weight at the state level. You can't just sort of willy-nilly as a prosecutor throw out the fact that someone's a felon, but sometimes you can. Maybe you can't say what it is. Certainly a pattern is a difficult thing to prove in court to be able to bring that evidence in. But it is a very interesting chess game that the president would have to play, given the potential exposure later down the line at the state level. The pardon doesn't cover you at the state level. And if you accept responsibility for a crime like that with a pardon, can it be discussed at the state level? And then I guess it's up to who the people in the jury box are as to what kind of politics they believe in.
Oh, it's all politics. And when politics and the law intersect, it's always ugly. It's always messy.
And fascinating.
Yeah,
right?
and fascinating.
Like super fascinating.
Exactly. Thanks so much, Ashley.
Nerd.
Appreciate it. See you later.